أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وآله الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم. Okay, so we, inshallah, I think this is going to be our last session for Quran, and after this we will move on to Sunnah, but I'm not 100% sure, we'll see. It looks like this is going to be our last one about Quran, and that has to do with the discussion of naskh, or abrogation, in the Quran. What does that mean? We'll talk about the definition of naskh, and then we'll get to the difference between naskh and something else called takhsis. They're very similar, and so this is also discussed in fiqh or usul al-fiqh. And then we have an acceptable versus unacceptable naskh. Different takes on naskh might make it acceptable or unacceptable. And then after that, we want to talk about the different types of naskh and nasikh. We'll get to these inshallah. And finally, we have a couple questions to go through as well. Alright, so this naskh, that is a big one. This is a big one we have, actually. It's a big topic in Ijtihad and Taqlid. In other words, a mujtahid, if they want to do Ijtihad, they will have to figure these things out too when it comes to the Quran. Okay? Now, naskh, we also have it when it comes to the Sunnah, but usually when we say the word naskh, the first thing that comes to mind is the Quran itself. Okay? And so, what is this naskh that we find in the Quran? Well, the definition, it says, the lifting of a previous legislation, seemingly permanent, and I'll give examples for this, by means of a newer legislation, such that the two are mutually exclusive and one cannot exist with the other. So, for example, I might tell you to give candy to the kids. So when you listen to this, when you hear this, me as the one who's telling you what to do, what not to do, let's say I'm, God forbid, the prophet or something, and I'm telling the people that this is a rule that you have. When you see the kids, give them candy, or give kids candy. When you hear this, that means anytime you see a kid, till the end of time, you give them candy. Now, of course, you might not live more than 10, 20, 30, 50, 100 years, but as long as you're alive, you give candy to the kids. Okay, that's what we understand from it. Now, all of a sudden, this legislation is lifted by another one. 10 days later, 10 months later, 10 years later, another rule I come and give you, and I say, don't give kids candy anymore. Okay, so what happened here? What happened was naskh, or abrogation, takes place. One rule is lifted by another rule that's newer, that comes later. So if it was just me and that first rule, I would have said, okay, this rule is unlimited and unrestricted by any time. It's supposed to go forever. Just like we have salat, we have fasting, all of these, we believe that, these rules are there till the end of time, right? Well, the same thing here. But when that second rule comes, what we find out is, Allah didn't disclose to us that there's an expiration date for this rule. It was us and this rule only. It was us and this bayan. It was us and this statement from Allah or from the Quran or from wherever else that has authority over us. At first glance, yes, we understood from it that this is an endless, timeless thing. It goes on forever. But later on, through that second legislation that comes, we find out that in Allah's knowledge, He knew that this is going to have an expiration date. But He just didn't disclose it to us. Now, question, why didn't He disclose? There can be different reasons. We might get to it later. Sometimes there is a reason for not disclosing it. And the example that we usually hear in this regard is which one? Is the one about, it's called Ayat al-Najwa. As Shia, it's one of the verses that we're going to remember. Yeah, it's the verse that says that, O people, O you who believe, when you want to speak to the Prophet, when you want to do najwa, privately speak with the Prophet, give a sadaqah beforehand. And so the verse that comes right after that verse abrogates this one. Some time had passed, you've all heard the story, that no one was really willing to sit down with the Prophet anymore because they had to pay, not the Prophet, but they had to pay sadaqah to the poor before sitting with the Prophet. The only one that we've heard is who did that was Imam Ali alayhi salam, that he took a dinar that he had, which is a gold coin, and he broke it into 10 dirhams, which is silver coins. And so he would go to the Prophet, but before that, every time he would go, he would give a sadaqah. He would give a dirham in the way of Allah to the poor and needy. Okay, so now after some time, no one's really going to the Prophet anymore. It's as if Allah wanted to prove a point to these people. These people, when they see the rule, it says that you have to pay a sadaqah every time. Okay, that means from now on till the end of the Prophet's life, whenever we want to see the Prophet and talk to him privately, we have to give sadaqah before. And so they're like, we're not about that life. We're not interested. Okay, so they stopped going. After a while, the next verse was revealed. أَأَشْفَقْتُمْ أَن تُقَدِّمُوا بَيْنَ يَدَيْ نَجْوَكُمْ صَدَقَةً. Oh, are you don't want to do this? Fine. Then instead, just promise that you're going to be good Muslims, you're going to give zakat, you're going to pray, and these things. Just be normal Muslims, man. Just don't ditch the Prophet like this, so to speak. This is one of the best examples that we have in the Quran for naskh. Alright, the first rule was give sadaqah whenever you want to see the Prophet or speak to him privately. The next rule comes later, a little while later. It says, hey, there was an expiration date on that. From this day forward, you don't have to. God, it seems, wanted to prove something to these people. Who the real ones are versus who the fake ones are. Okay? So that's the definition of naskh. Lifting of a previous legislation by means of a newer one. This previous one was seemingly permanent though, but then it turns out it was a temporary one. Such that the two are mutually exclusive. This is very important. The both cannot be true at the same time. One says give sadaqah, the other one says you don't have to give sadaqah. Okay. And they're all talking about the same mawdu', the same subject here. Okay? Giving sadaqah when you want to speak to the Holy Prophet. Why do I say this? Why do I emphasize on the subject that they're talking both about the same exact thing? Because if that's not the case, it'll be something called takhsis. And that's where the difference between naskh and takhsis comes into the picture. Takhsis comes from khas. Khas means specific. Okay? We have this idea of takhsis all throughout the Quran, all throughout our hadiths. Everywhere you look, you will have takhsis, and it's something perfectly fine. It's not abrogation though. It is not to be confused with naskh. What is the difference between these two? The difference between the two is such that, there are different things that they've said. I really liked what Ayatollah Ma'rifat says in his book. He has a book called Tamheed. It's all about the Quranic sciences. I really liked what he says there, but this is not necessarily the only difference between them. But the main difference he says between naskh, abrogation, and takhsis, which is when you use a qualifier for something, when you restrict something to a smaller scope, when you narrow it down to a certain group. The difference between these two is one, which is naskh, has to do with narrowing down. Naskh is when a ruling is made exclusive to a certain time. Okay, so every moment after the rule comes from Allah, every moment that is something that is incumbent upon us. From here till the end of time, if I break up time into units, right? Let's say there's 1,000,000 units till the end of time. Every unit of these, every million time unit, yes, this rule is holding from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's not restricted to a certain number of these time units. When I look at the first rule, when I look at it initially, I'm like, okay, this rule is unrestricted, so it has to do with all times. Those 1,000,000 units are all, yes, subject to this rule. When naskh comes, when a nasikh, an abrogating verse comes after, what is it telling me? It's saying out of all the units of time that you thought this rule would apply to, some of those we're making an exception for. Some of those units of time. So you thought it was going to be 1,000,000, it's going to only be 500,000, let's say. All right. If I give you hours or minutes or time or a day, you thought it was going to be 100 years, but it's only 50 years. So an exception is being made for what? Time. Naskh says we have two rules. Both are talking about the exact same thing. One is making an exception though. For what? For time. Versus takhsis. What is takhsis? Takhsis doesn't touch time. Takhsis touches the examples and instances and applications of a ruling. I'll give you an example. I think it'll become clear. For example, let's go back to the give the kids candy example. You have one hadith, for example, that says give kids candy. Okay? Then another hadith says don't give naughty kids candy. Okay? Don't give naughty kids candy. Okay? Is there abrogation here? Do you see a problem here? Do we see a problem here? If I call you up one day, I'm like, hey, give the kids some candy. But then I call you back and I'm like, just make sure that you don't give the naughty kids candy. Do you see a problem here? Is it hard to reconcile here? You'll say, okay, so the first time when he called me and said, give kids candy, what he actually meant was, and what he had in mind was, the good kids, not the naughty ones. But when the second rule came, now I know I can reconcile them, and okay, we come up with this conclusion that you don't give the naughty ones candy, you give only the good kids candy. Alright, this is takhsis. Did we touch time here? No, this rule is there forever. We just narrowed down not the time, but what? The cases, the instances of they call it in Arabic, the afrad. The different people are different cases and applications, okay? So out of the 1,000 kids, 500 of them only get candy. Here, that's what is being narrowed down. This is takhsis. Making a ruling specific to a certain group or a certain case, certain category, and so on. Takhsis, you will have it everywhere. For example, the Quran says, Aqimus salah. I want you to pray. Alright, or establish prayer. It's a very general rule. So that means every second, all the time, in every way we can, we have to do salat. Another one comes and says, Aqim as-salata liduluki ash-shams ila ghasaq al-layl, and then Quran al-Fajr. These are the times. Okay, so we had a general rule that said pray. But here it's saying, you pray, this is the types of prayer I want from you. Another hadith, or verse of the Quran or whatever, says, I want you to pray, but pray with wudu, with ablution. So now I know, okay, not any prayer is desired by Allah. What is it? A prayer with wudu, right? At Fajr time, at these different conditions are given to me. So this is called, and I'm using the term broadly here, takhsis. Okay? Sometimes it's called takhsis, sometimes it's called taqlid, whatever technical terms there are in this regard. Okay, so that's the difference between naskh and takhsis. Takhsis happens all the time. Lillahi ala nasi hajjul bayt. Go perform hajj. You barely have those details of hajj in the Quran. The hadith give us those. This is all taqyid, this is all takhsis. But in the Quran, what you will have not too much of is naskh. Alright? That's the one where one rule comes and is exactly talking about the same thing the other one's talking about and lifts the other one. So that's the difference between these two. Okay. So having said all of that now, a question comes up. Naskh means what? Means there was a rule and a God changed his mind about it. It's as if. Theologically, is that even possible? Now this is not a fiqhi discussion, yeah? But when you look in the fiqhi books, some of them at least that are talking about naskh will also talk about this, from what I remember. Yeah? It's not just a Quranic sciences thing. They also talk about it. Alright. God, we said before, legislates based on real good and bad. Okay, there's something good about something, so Allah says wajib for you to do it. Remember we used the word expediency, maslaha, mafsada, these ones. Alright, you see this comes back to help us here. If something has good in it to the point that Allah makes it wajib, how is He going to come and now abrogate the same thing and says, no, it's not wajib anymore? This does not make sense. This doesn't add up theologically, because didn't God know? Yeah, so this is a problem that we have here. And it's the same problem we have in something else called bada' as well. Okay? In theology we have these concepts. But the answer to that is this. Wait. When Allah prescribed something initially and made it seem like it is without an expiration date, did it have an expiration date in His mind too or not? The answer is obviously it did have an expiration date. In other words, Allah knew that the maslaha, the good in this, is one that is temporary. That means once the time comes, after that it's not going to have that maslaha, that good anymore. For us, it seemed, because we talked about this before too, we don't have access to Allah's immaculate knowledge. Do we? We don't. So if we don't have access to it, what are we left with? The literature. The words that come our way, okay? The hadiths that we have, the Quran and all of that, that's all we have access to. So we're supposed to judge based on that. We're supposed to pass verdicts based on what we have access to. So yes, in Allah's knowledge, He was aware that the maslaha and the good in something has an expiration date after which there is no maslaha anymore. But the way it was worded to us, was such that at first glance we're like, okay, this is probably just like any other rule. It has a maslaha and good in it forever. It's just that later on Allah let us know that wasn't the case. Now someone might say, well, why didn't God just tell us from the beginning? Is He lying? No, He never said. He never told us there's a maslaha forever in this. He said, give sadaqah before you sit down with the Prophet. He didn't say anything after that. And we said, oh Allah, you're the Lord, we will listen. That's all He said. There's no not telling the truth here. At the same time though, there isn't lack of knowledge regarding the temporary maslaha versus permanent one in Allah's eyes. No, it's just that we don't have access to His knowledge. And so we thought the maslaha was an ongoing one. Turns out it was not. And so the unacceptable one, according to Tamheed, he says, for Allah to have a change in opinion, this means there was a mistake in the previous one that the legislator became aware of later. And so they abrogated the first rule. Happens all the time with human beings, right? Making the second ruling the more complete, quote unquote, and correct one. This means there's always a chance there will be a third or fourth ruling even. Even when you change it for the second time, you might change it for the third time, fourth time even. He says this is unacceptable in Allah's eye, when it comes to Allah. He's not going to figure it out later. He's figured it out from the get-go. Correct? And so this is unacceptable for Allah if this is our understanding of naskh. But he says no, that is not the essence of naskh. What is the essence of naskh? The essence of naskh is, or the acceptable naskh is naskh on the out. It's naskh on the outside, while there's actually no naskh at all. That's something to think about. We're talking about naskh. He says it's not even naskh. Real naskh is not even naskh. Because real naskh would mean something is abrogated within Allah's knowledge. No, there was no abrogation in Allah's knowledge. It was just a ruling went on and it ended when it was supposed to end. Okay? So in reality it was a seeming naskh, or seemingly it was naskh, but in reality it was not. I'm going to open a parenthesis here now. Bada. Some of us have heard of bada. And the Shi'i school of thought is called out because of this, that you believe that sometimes Allah changes His mind, not just when it comes to legislation and do's and don'ts and law and ahkam and fiqh. You even believe sometimes Allah changes His mind on things that are happening in the real world, in alam al-kawn, alam al-takween. And they'll have their reasons for why they think that that's the case for us. We say no, bada, meaning Allah changed His mind or figured it out, like, you know what, I'm going to save Prophet Yusuf. It's not like that. We don't believe in that. If we say bada, that means that us observing as an outside observer, we thought Yusuf was done, then things changed. And the Quran uses this term, bada lahum or bada lahu. It uses that term. We believe that no, Allah's knowledge is immaculate and is very accurate. And so if it seems like He changed His mind, or we sound like we're saying He changed His mind because we use the term bada, doesn't mean that's actually happening. It's happening for us who are observers. Or else with Allah's knowledge, nothing has changed. So there is no abrogation really. That is acceptable naskh. Acceptable naskh means that if for me things changed, me who's dealing with the text and the scripture and the literature, not for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the same justification we have for bada, we also have here in naskh. Okay? Now, having said that, what we get is that this acceptable naskh will only make sense when it comes to gradual ahkam. Ahkam that come one after another. Because first, Allah wants to tell us something so that we think that it's unlimited, unrestricted. After a while, He'll let us know. If it has to do with us, we are beings that are governed by time and bound by time. If naskh has to do with us, then we have everything to do with gradualness. So then naskh will also have to do with gradualness. So in other words, guys, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was to send down the sharia all at once, naskh, we wouldn't have it. Only when it's gradual is when it happens. It's very interesting. But that's not the only reason why ahkam are sent down gradually. That's one of the reasons sometimes. But one of the reasons also that gradually the ahkam change or progress or develop is, for example, the people just aren't ready. So we all know about how khamr and intoxicating drinks and alcohol were made haram in the Quran. Were they made haram right away? No. It just shows that how big a thing this was back then, even till today, this idea of alcohol. Like, look at the culture that Islam has established, that you and I, we are turned off by it. We're disgusted by even the thought of consuming something like that. But back then it wasn't that easy to get this culture established, but Allah slowly did it. How? Well, first He said, don't get close to your salat, or try to stay away from it, it's bad for you, the bad outweighs the good, and so on. Then He said, don't pray when you're intoxicated. Then after a while, Allah said, just don't get close to it at all. This is amal al-shaytan. This is something that is the doing of shaitan. So gradualness sometimes has other reasons as well. Okay? The people getting them ready for a change, something like that. But not always. Sometimes naskh is the reason. But we don't have too many cases. We'll get to that. We don't have too many cases of naskh. Okay, so now, moving on to our next slide. We have different types of naskh now. Because of the different types of mansukh and the different types of nasikh that happen. So what does that mean, mansukh and nasikh? Naskh means abrogation. Mansukh means that which is being abrogated. Nasikh means the abrogator. Ism fa'il, ism maf'ul. Okay. So sometimes we'll have different types of mansukh. Meaning what? Meaning that which is being abrogated, that which is being nullified, okay, has different types. And as a result, the naskh is going to be a different type of naskh, because the mansukh is different. Sometimes no, we don't look at the mansukh, we look at the nasikh, the thing that is abrogating something else. That might have different categories and types. So let's get into that. The different types of mansukh that we have. Now these, I will say, this is a bigger deal in the Sunni school than it is in the Shi'i school. But let's go through them. We have naskh of hukm and tilawa. Naskh of hukm, which is the ruling of something, the law of something, and tilawa. Tilawa means to recite, the recitation of something. Alright, what does that mean? That means that a verse was sent down, and in that verse there was a ruling, and that verse was nullified and put aside, and also the ruling that it came with was put aside. What does that remind you of? Alteration of the Quran and tahrif. One of the forms of tahrif and alteration of the Quran was tahrif bin naqisa, meaning to take away and cut out from the Quran certain parts. That one we said everyone believes that that's not possible. Everyone believes that that is something that for sure has not happened in the Muslims, amongst the Muslims, Shia and Sunni. But then we have this idea of naskh of hukm and tilawa, which means the ruling is gone and the verse is no longer recited, it's gone. It's not in the Quran anymore. We're like, wait a minute, that's tahrif then. Yeah? So this one, the Shi'i school dismisses completely, but there are some in the Sunni school, it might even be the majority, who believe in this naskh. You might say it's tahrif though, they say no, it's naskh. It's not tahrif. I'll give you an example. It's a famous one. These are famous examples. They'll say that Aisha said that there was a verse of the Quran that was nullified. The ruling in it and the verse itself was put aside. And there's an interesting story about that as well. We're not going to get into the story of it. But anyway, it says that she said that the verse used to say, "Ashru rada'atin ma'lumatin yuharrimna," that if you nurse a baby 10 times, then that baby becomes mahram to you, as a child to you, as if. But then this was nullified and abrogated. This verse, Ashru rada'at, you don't find it in the Quran anymore. What do you find? You don't find this in the Quran either, but she says that the verse changed to Khamsu rada'atin, 5. So that for a certain period of time, according to her, 10 times nursing was the amount necessary for a child to become like your own. When I say that, I mean in the ahkam of mahramiyya. Okay? It changed to 5. Why? Because the verse changed. So she says the 10 one went aside. The ruling that came with it went aside. The hukum and the tilawa were abrogated. What we're left with is the verse that says 5 only. But guess what? The ruling of the 5 stayed, but the verse of 5 even was gone and deleted. So in reality we have 2 naskhs in one case. One is naskh al-hukm wa tilawa, that the verse of 10 and the ruling of it went and were deleted. Then a verse came down that said 5 times only is enough, but then that verse got deleted, but the ruling of it stayed. Okay? Yes, it's kind of messy. It gets kind of messy. But this is what the example that is given for that. Alright, so that is the example of hukm and tilawa, the first part that I said, the 10. But then you also have, naskh of just tilawa. So a verse comes down, gives you a ruling, then the verse is deleted, but the ruling stays. We say this is also tahrif. You're getting rid of Quran. You're getting a verse of the Quran deleted from the book. Okay, that was our definition of tahrif bin naqisa, to delete a verse. Was it a verse or not? Yes, it was a verse. Was it a hadith Qudsi? No, it was an actual verse of the Quran. It got deleted. Okay, then what is this? The ruling stayed though. Naskhut tilawa only. And the example for that they give is the stoning of the adulterer and adulteress. They say that there was a verse that said you're supposed to stone them, but then the verse was deleted from the Quran, but the rule has stayed. Once again, the Shia doesn't believe in these. Okay? Then you have naskh of hukum. That which was abrogated was not a verse of the Quran plus or minus the ruling that it came with. The only thing that was abrogated, the only mansukh here was the ruling of something. The verse stayed, the ruling was deleted. That is the example that I gave, and we have other examples too. Ayatun Najwa. Give sadaqah before you speak to the Prophet. This is a verse of the Quran that has a ruling for us, correct? The ruling is deleted. The verse stayed though, and was ensued by the verse that deleted the ruling that it came with. Now someone might say, well, why keep the verse when it's not applicable anymore? There are explanations here of why that's the case. Sometimes the reason to keep a verse, although we don't really need the ruling in it anymore, is to show the process of how things happened. Like for example, the verses that talks about alcohol or khamr, wine. We don't need to keep those verses, but when you have how gradual Allah, the process, how it works, then you gain an appreciation of how things happened in the past and how this heritage or legacy has reached us. Okay? Islam has reached us. There's a lot of other things that can be said about why you keep the verse in there. But in the end, this is the only, for us at least, this is the only acceptable form or type of naskh when it comes to the mansukh, that which is being abrogated, is the fact that is the one that says that only the ruling, the hukum, has been deleted, but the verse is still there. Okay, so these are types of mansukh that we have. Sometimes though, we're not even looking at the mansukh. What are we looking at? Nasikh, that which is abrogating. Okay, that itself has three categories. Sometimes you have a verse coming and abrogating a previous verse, the ruling of the previous verse. Okay, everyone says this is acceptable. Okay, sometimes no. You have a verse of the Quran that has a ruling in it, but another verse doesn't come and abrogate it. Something that gives you 100% certainty, whether it's a hadith mutawatir, whether it's an ijma' and a consensus by all of the Muslims throughout all of history, let's just say, right, that says that this ruling has changed. Although the Quran says it, but it has changed. Here there are different opinions of does that count or not? Think about it. You have a hadith mutawatir, just like hadith Taqlid, that like hundreds of people have narrated. You know the Prophet said this one, which we don't have too many of these examples, by the way. You know the Prophet said it for sure. Let's just say the Prophet said that salat isn't wajib. Okay? Like some of these Shias today, the Ismailis, that's what they say, right? Their Imam said, salat's not wajib anymore. He did naskh of what the Quran says, let's say. If my Prophet, I see him, hear him saying this, or a mutawatir hadith by him, one that has been narrated so much that I become 100% sure he actually said those words, reaches me, can naskh happen here or not? Some have said, well, look, what is the strongest thing we have in Islam? What is the heaviest, most weightiest thing that we have in Islam? It's the Quran. So it doesn't make sense for something weaker to abrogate that which is stronger. Right? But most of our ulama have said no. At the end of the day, if the Prophet is coming and telling us that something is abrogated, and I'm 100% sure, think about it. The Prophet knocks on your door, he says, hey, from this day forward, this verse has been abrogated. You can't take it from him? What's the problem? What's the mani'? What's the issue there? Yeah, the Quran is the number one source of authority, that's correct. But this is also authoritative at the end of the day. If you become 100% sure, then what's the problem? There is no problem. This is something that I think only Sheikh Mufid says is not okay. But the rest of the Shi'i school, the big shots, they all say there's no problem in it. All right. But has this ever happened? No. This has never happened. No one out there has ever claimed that we have something that's not a verse of the Quran, that we're 100% sure is true, that is abrogating a verse of the Quran. We don't have anything like that. And that leaves us with finally a hujjah. Sometimes you have 100% certainty through a hadith because it's mutawatir. All right, you're like, does it abrogate or not? Sometimes no, you have an isolated report from a reliable chain, but it's an isolated one. It's a solitary report, one report that I have. It's hujjah on me, that's correct. We talked about this before. Sometimes your hujjah doesn't hit the target though. Okay? It's hujjah on me in normal situations to take this hadith. But can this hadith now go against the Quran? They say no. Here we can. That's true that it's hujjah on me, it's binding on me. But in the end, it is still a dhanni, they say. Still, you're 70, 80%, it's accurate. The rest of the 20%, Allah said, follow it, I'll take it from you. But all in all, that's in normal situations, not when it goes up against the Quran. It does not have what it takes to go against the Quran. So with this one, I would say everyone says no. When it's a solitary report that's not mutawatir, that doesn't give you 100% certainty, the way you know right now it's daytime outside, then no, you can't take that against the Quran and take it as abrogation. But once again, I mean, we don't even have too many cases, if any at all, like this as well, right? Where someone will come of the imams and says, hey, salat's not wajib anymore, right? Unless he's the Aga Khan imam. But out of the 12 imams that we have, no, we don't have that. I've heard this, that they say the Aga Khan has said that, it's not wajib, these things aren't wajib anymore. All right, so I would say that would be an example of abrogation. I hope people don't think that that's what the Shia say, although Ismailis are seen as Shia, but usually when we say Shia, we mean the 12er Shia. All right, so having said all of that, let's go on to our last slide, where we talk about this question here. If you all noticed, throughout this talk, we kept saying, we don't have too many cases of this. We don't, we're not sure about that. Yeah, there's maybe one example of this, two examples of that. The question that arises, and this is what some scholars have brought up. For example, Muhammad Rida Muzaffar, he's very famous, and his books are studied in the Hawza. His usul books are the main books, at least in the Iranian Hawza. Till today, his books are studied in the 3rd or 4th year onwards. 4th year to 6th year, we're studying Usul al-Fiqh by Muzaffar. In his book, he says, look, this discussion isn't too important because we don't even have too many cases that you'll have abrogation, but you also won't have hadiths after it that will also help you. In other words, even if you weren't able to figure out that this is naskh, you would have hadiths that are telling you that this has been abrogated. You would know in one way or another. There might be a couple, 2, 3, 4, you can count with your fingers how many of these cases. So this is not a very significant discussion, he says. Okay? To even have to begin with. And so what are we gathering here for? We're gathering to learn the ijtihad process, right? That's what we're coming here for. Someone might say, then what's the point of this if we don't have any cases of abrogation? Okay? But there's answers to this, and I'm inclined towards these answers. If a person wants to learn about ijtihad and wants to be a mujtahid, they can't just be like, you know what, naskh in the past hasn't had too many cases, so you know what, let's not even discuss it. Wait a minute, who told you you don't have too many cases? Who told you? He says, well, Ayatollah Khouyi says that we only have one case of naskh in the Quran. So we don't need to have this discussion. Well, excuse me, that means that you're not a mujtahid anymore. You're a muqallid of Sayyid Khouyi in the matter of naskh. That's the part that you'll see again. This happens all the time. There will be people who are anti-ijtihad, anti-taqlid. They don't know it themselves, but in certain matters they're doing taqlid. They'll bring hadiths for you, and they'll say, see, I don't need to do taqlid. I follow what Usul al-Kafi has brought and given me of hadiths. Right? Well, excuse me, number one, who told you this hadith is reliable? You're doing taqlid of al-Kafi then, number one. And number two, the chapter that al-Kafi has brought this hadith under, that's his own ijtihad. What if this hadith has to do with something else? He's taking his understanding of the hadith and putting the hadith in this category or this chapter of the book. While this might have had to do with something else. You're doing taqlid of him in the chapter even, that he's brought the hadith in. These people, they don't understand that they're still doing taqlid. It's just they're doing taqlid of more classical scholars, and so they feel like, yeah, we're doing taqlid of Imam Zaman, for example. Or we do taqlid of Imam as-Sadiq alayhi salam. And then when you break it down, there's like 10 forms of taqlid in there that they might be missing. Anyway, here also, naskh is a discussion at the end of the day. Okay? It's a discussion at the end of the day we need to have. Why? For two reasons. Number one, some will say we don't need to have this discussion because we have a rule that says, whenever in doubt, assume the lack of naskh. If you're not sure that there was naskh somewhere or not, assume that there was no naskh. And we have this with tahara and najasa. We have this with halal and haram. We have this, it's called the rule of bara'ah. Bara'ah means everything is permissible unless proven otherwise. Question now, we have this rule in Islam. A mujtahid, can he just come and be like, you know what? I'm going to close my eyes. I'm not going to look at any hadiths. And anything that comes up that we might have a ruling in, I'll just say asalatul bara'ah, the principle and rule of bara'ah. Everything's permissible unless proven otherwise. I'm going to close my ears, I'm going to close my eyes, and just say everything's halal, nothing's been proven to be haram to me. Or no, you can fall back on this rule after you've done your due diligence. I look in the hadith corpus, I look in the Quran, I don't find anything, let's say, about smoking. All right? And so now, in the end, I'm left with a doubt. Is smoking in and of itself, not because it's harmful to the body or any other thing, no, in and of itself. Let's assume there's a form of smoking that doesn't cause harm to the body. In and of itself, can I declare it haram or not? Well, I did my due diligence. I looked at many places as I could. In the hadiths, in the Quran, I couldn't find anything that implies such. And so now I'm left with a doubt. Now that I have the doubt, this is an established doubt, they call it in fiqh. This established doubt, how do I deal with it? What's the rule for these kinds of doubts? Asalatul bara'ah, the asl and principle and rule of bara'ah and permissibility unless proven otherwise. Naskh, same thing. You have a rule. You're telling me we should not have the discussion of naskh. Why? Because we have a rule that says, whenever in doubt, what do? You just assume that there is no naskh. No. Go look at each case that has been claimed to be naskh, and then we'll talk. Then once you have not come to a definitive conclusion whether we have naskh or not in a certain situation, then you say, okay, I'm going to fall back on the rule that says, assume that there's no naskh here. Okay? Reason number two that someone might say, no, we don't need this, is what I said. Reason number two that we don't need to have the discussion of naskh is we don't have too many cases. I said, yeah, Ayatollah Khouy, for example, is famously known to have believed in only one actual naskh in the Quran. That's all he believes in. Okay? But did you know that a person like Ayatollah Ma'rifat in his book of Tamheed, where he's speaking of Quranic sciences, he goes through, I don't know how many, it was like 228 cases that have been claimed to have had naskh in them. Now, he doesn't narrow it all the way down to one only, but also, once he goes through all of them, and it's interesting, he's dedicated like 70 pages just to case studies of all these cases to see which one is actually naskh and which one is not. And most of them are like takhsis and things like that. They're not naskh. And so in the end, he'll have like maybe 5, 10, 15, I don't know how many, that he believes are naskh. But look, 230 cases. They say we have only 500 verses in the Quran that have to do with fiqh and ahkam to begin with. So if these 228 cases are all fiqh related, which they're not, but let's assume they were, there'll be half of your verses of the Quran that have to do with fiqh that might have naskh in it. So I have to study, I have to do the work, put the work in. No, I'm a mujtahid, but I'm going to just follow Ayatollah Khouy here. Okay, so you're muqallid. You're not a mujtahid. Okay, these are the things that we have to do if we're mujtahids. So, Ayatollah Khouy even, it's interesting. Ayatollah Khouy believes in one case, right? But guess what? In his book of Al-Bayan, which is not even a fiqhi book, it's a tafsir book of his, he dedicates 100 pages to naskh. Because at the end of the day, you have to dismiss or refute or accept. You can't be in the middle. Okay, so if he's going to do that, yeah, he's going to 100. This is not even a fiqhi book. I didn't have time to look at his fiqhi books. Just in his Quran book, his tafsir book, 100 pages he's dedicated to this discussion of naskh. Yes, he only ends up with one, but he did the work. Okay? Now, those are two reasons why someone might say we should not study naskh. But there are some who will say, no, we should study naskh. Do you know why? We have stories upon stories of the Imams pointing out that if a person does not know the nasikh from the mansukh in the Quran, they don't know anything about Islam. Okay? So now we're stuck here. We just said there's only one case according to Ayatollah Khoui. But then the Imams are saying that, do you know, there were cases, Imam Ali, Imam Sadiq, they come across people who say, we're Islamic judges. We're Islamic faqihs and jurists. And so the Imam says, do you know the nasikh from the mansukh? They're like, no, we don't. They're like, you don't know anything. But if it's just one case, why is the Imam saying that? Okay? So, let me go back. There are some who say we should have the discussion because the hadiths are telling us there are a lot of cases. What I want to say is they have misunderstood these hadiths. No, the hadiths are not saying that. They're saying something else. So we agree with this person who says, yes, we need to have this discussion, but not because of his reason that the hadiths are saying, but because of the reason we said before. Even if you have one case, even if you have 0 cases of naskh in the Quran, it's a discussion that has to be had. That's our reason. But some will say, no, we have to have this discussion because the hadiths are telling us if you don't know nasikh from mansukh, you don't know anything. It seems that there's like a third of the verses of the Quran, a tenth of the verses of the Quran, let's say, that will have naskh in them that we have to be aware of. Right? And they use the word naskh, the Imams. They says, Imam Ali, marra ala qadin. He passed by an Islamic jurist. He said to him, هل تعرف الناسخ من المنسوخ عن المنسوخ? Can you tell them apart? The nasikh from the mansukh? He says, no. He says, you're halakt wa ahlakt. You destroyed and you got destroyed and you destroyed others with your jurist, being a jurist. What kind of ijtihad is this that you don't even know the nasikh from the mansukh? Baba, Imam Ali, Ayatollah Khoui, then he doesn't know what he's talking about either because he only has one case. You're making it sound, Imam Ali, like there's a lot of cases. Another one, Imam Sadiq, he told Abu Hanifa, it's famous. He said to him, you're the faqih of Iraq? He said, yes. You're the jurist of Iraq? Yes, I am. He says, so how do you give them fatwas, the people? He said, I use the book of Allah and the sunnah of the Prophet. So the Imam told him, do you know the book of Allah the way it's supposed to be known? Do you know the nasikh from the mansukh? And he says, no. He says, yes, He says, yes, I do. The Imam says, you're claiming a big claim. This is a knowledge that only the Imams have. What do you mean you know it? You don't know it. You're making stuff up. Okay? And so on and so forth. These hadiths are making it sound like there's a lot of cases of that. But that's not the case. You know why? Because, and this is our last point here, because naskh has different usages. I left this for the end. The hadiths, when they say, do you know the nasikh from the mansukh? They're speaking in a very general sense and for naskh that encompasses takhsis and taqlid and all those things as well. Any form of manipulation of a rule or of a verse or of a hadith, narrowing it down in any way, even in the acceptable way of takhsis that we talked about in the beginning, it's also used, the naskh is also used sometimes for that. The Imam, when he says, do you know the nasikh from the mansukh? Meaning, do you know those things, that those other verses or hadiths that come and explain some verses of the Quran or not? Do you know those? He says, yeah, one of them said no, one of them said yes, I do. And the Imam said, you lie. Right? So for example, when it says, aqim as-salat, establish the prayer, but then another verse says liduluk al-shams and all conditions, hajj, how to perform it, all that. A lot of these details don't come in the Quran. Do you know how to reconcile Quranic verses, hadiths, bring them together, figure out what is exactly desired from you from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by Allah? If you don't know that, then you have a problem. And so this requires a good grasp of the hadith and the Quran literature to be able to do that ijtihad. So the hadiths aren't saying that specific type of naskh that we talked about for an hour now, there's a lot of cases of that in the Quran. That's not what they're saying. They're saying that you have to have a good grasp all in all of everything. And that's what the Imams were condemning these people for, because they were not mujtahids. Okay? So to conclude from all of the above, the Quran, the naskh in the Quran, it is a discussion to have. There are some who say that no, we don't need it. For 2 reasons, we dismiss those 2. There are some who say, yes, we should have it, because we have hadiths that say how important it is. We say, those hadiths, you've misunderstood them. So we agree with you that, yes, we have to have the discussion, but not because the hadiths are saying there's a lot of cases, because according to some, there's only one case of that specific type of naskh. But still, you have to have the discussion, not because of the abundance or lack thereof of cases, but rather because it's a discussion to be had, because there's a lot of claimed cases. There are a lot of potential cases. Even if you dismiss all of them, it's still a discussion that we have to have. So these were all, we had maybe 6 or 7 sessions on how the mujtahideen go to the Quran for their ijtihad. And I think I'm going to wrap it up this week. Okay? And from next week we're going to have to start talking about the sunnah. That is where it's all at. Okay? The hadith corpus. Because the ijtihad that we have, I would say 70, 80, 90, depending on different things, percent of it comes from the hadiths, not from the Quran. Now there are some ulama that say we need to go to the Quran more, but right now the mainstream is that Shahid Mutahari, I think, or whoever it was, said this. He said a Hawza student can go to the Hawza, not ever learn any of the Quran except the verses that have to do with fiqh, and still make it out fine, yeah, and become a mujtahid. Okay? And so there are other ulama who say this is wrong. We should have a huge grasp of the Quran, not just like at a minimal level like that. So anyway, all in all though, the amount that we use the Quran is nowhere close to the amount that the hadith corpus is used. And it makes sense because the hadiths are more specific. They have a lot more details in them. That's where the real ijtihad is. I don't want to say real ijtihad is happening, but a lot of the ijtihad is happening. When it comes to the sunnah, there's some very important discussions there that were not applicable to the Quranic discussions. Reliability of sanad. We don't have that with the Quran. We have that with the hadiths though. And so there's a lot to discuss there, inshallah. So from our next session, we'll move on into the sunnah of the Prophet. Any questions before we end? Yes?
So the different types of nasakh, do we only ijtihad support one version?
Yes. Only when the mansukh, okay, is a ruling of a verse, not the verse in the tilawa of the verse. As Shia, that's the only one we accept. Okay? Naskhul hukum only. Okay? When the mansukh is a hukum, a ruling only, not the verse. The verses has to stay in the Quran, or else it leads to alteration and tahrif.
Was the example for that the verse of
Najwa. Naskhul hukum is najwa. We have a verse. It says, pay sadaqah before you speak to the Prophet. The ruling is gone now, is deleted. But the verse is still there. The verse that came after said that rule no longer exists. Yeah.
what was the name of the type of mansukh when a verse came and it was nullified by another verse that came later?
That one that doesn't have a name. Those are the different types of nasikh. So sometimes a verse abrogates another verse. That was the first type that we had. That's the one you're asking about. We don't have a name for it. We just say that's when the nasikh is a Quranic verse. Okay? So your nasikh sometimes has to do with mansukh, sometimes has to do with nasikh. Sometimes the nasikh is a Quranic verse. Yeah, it's abrogating another Quranic verse. Or if it's 100% certainty proof, or it's one of the hujaj. One of those 3 that we had. Okay? All right. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Salawat. Allahumma salli ala